Elizabeth Jennings was a prolific English poet. Born in Lincolnshire, she and her family moved to Oxford when she was 6, and she lived there for the rest of her life. She worked in advertising for a short while before becoming a full-time writer. Her first complete collection of poems was published in 1953. For her second collection, A Way of Looking, she won the Somerset Maugham Award in 1956. Jennings published about 25 unique collections of poetry over nearly 50 years. Much of her work has a strong spiritual theme. It gained praise for its clarity and simplicity of expression. The poem Father to Son is an expression of the rift that sets in between generations. It is written from the perspective of a father who speaks of how he is unable to relate to or connect with his son. The father describes how he makes various attempts to be sympathetic towards and to establish a connection with his son. He, however, is left disappointed as he is unable to do so. Here is a summary of the poem Father to Son by Elizabeth Jennings. The speaker in the poem is a father who tries to understand his son and in a way is speaking indirectly to his child. The father begins by expressing his inability to understand his son, even though they have lived in the same house for years. He feels as if he doesn't know his own child anymore. So he vainly attempts to rebuild a relationship with his son on the basis of what the son was like as a small child. The father wonders whether he has destroyed all his links with his son, or whether the son's concerns and interests are those in which the father is not involved. Their relationship seems to be like that between strangers, and they seem to have no way of communicating with each other. The father remarks how the son resembles him externally, but their minds and ideas are different. The father asserts that his son's interests are alien to his understanding. The father then goes on to say that he would have been more comfortable if his son had gone away, made mistakes, and returned home in repentance, much like the prodigal son in the biblical story. He prefers this to his son moving away permanently and living an independent life, one that the father can neither understand nor appreciate. The father feels that he would have forgiven his son's actions had his son left home and returned. The father imagines the happiness and love he would have felt for a son who came back to him after many years of absence. What is painful for the father, however, is that he and his son are living together and yet are unable to either understand or communicate with each other. The father expresses his inability to understand why his own sadness is expressed as anger. Ironically, both father and son are eager to make amends and form a relationship. Despite being unable to give anything to each other, both are eager to forgive what they see as the fault of the other. There is just one voice in this poem, that of the father's. The father seems to be helpless and troubled. He cannot seem to understand the reason behind his growing distance from his son. He is hurt by his inability to communicate or build a relationship with his son. A part of him is also angry due to this. The father could also be considered rigid and conservative in his ways. He cannot share his son's interests and is not comfortable with the thought of his son being wholly independent. The father is driven by love for his son. Despite not understanding or appreciating what his son does, he still wants to forgive his son and work on creating a loving relationship once again with his son. Now let us examine the poem closely. The poem is very clearly about a universal phenomenon, generation gap. Though the poem is written from a father's perspective, the concerns it highlights could apply to the relationship between any parent and child. Each generation has its own way of perceiving and doing things which the succeeding or preceding generation is unable to comprehend. The father in the poem says that he cannot love what his son loves, even though they are very similar to each other in outward appearance. He says that he cannot understand his own child even after having lived in the same house for years. There is a complete breakdown in communication between him and his son, and their relationship is like that between strangers. The theme of the poem is very apparent from these lines of the poem. I do not understand this child. I know nothing of him. We speak like strangers. There's no sign of understanding in the air. Yet what he loves I cannot share. Silence surrounds us. The language of the poem is simple yet evocative. We can easily sense the father's anguish. A notable feature of the poem is how sentences are broken across different lines to show continuity and fluidity of thought. This makes the poem come alive, much like natural spoken language. The rhyme scheme of the poem is not always consistent, especially in the first, fourth, and sixth lines of the stanzas. However, the second, third, and fifth lines are almost always rhyming. There is a slight deviation in the first stanza, though. Here, no does not sound like now and how, but it is a visual rhyme of the two words. That is, the spelling of no is similar to now and how, but its pronunciation is different. The irregularity in the rhyme scheme highlights the ongoing argument within the poem, that of two generations trying to understand each other but failing to do so. The poet has used a variety of symbols and biblical allusions in the poem. For instance, she has used the symbol of a seed to refer to the sun. The entire line could also be an allusion or reference to the biblical proverb, "As you sow, so shall you reap." In these lines, the father is wondering if the broken relationship between him and his son is a consequence of his past actions. Another allusion is in the line, "I would have him prodigal, returning to his father's house." This is a reference to the biblical parable of the prodigal son. In the story, the youngest son of a man foolishly wastes his inheritance. Despite his mistake, his father welcomes him back with open arms. The symbol of the globe and land stands for the common ground or understanding that needs to be created between parents and their children. Eventually, they have to inhabit a common space despite their differences. The poet uses antithesis in the poem to express the distance between the father and the son. In these lines, the father speaks of how his son looks like him, yet does not behave or think like him. Another example of antithesis can be seen when the poet juxtaposes the concepts of sorrow and love in the line, "Shaping from sorrow a new love." Here are some other figures of speech used in the poem.